Okay, so welcome back to the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. And today we have Dr. Alex O'Brien from the psychology department joining us to talk about perceptions, including visual and audio perceptions, and how our brain works. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. So we communicated through the email. The first thing I want to touch on is what you said in the email. That is, what we see in our brain is different sometimes from the real world. So how does perception work?
Well,
That's a hard question.
Yes. There's a couple different ways you could answer that question. I would say one of the themes that I talk about a lot when I'm trying to explain this concept to students for the first time is that when we have all these sensory stimuli external to us, all these different types of energy that our sensory systems can pick up on, that all of your sensory systems are transducing that energy from an electromagnetic signal or a pressure difference in the atmosphere,
Touching.
Pressure on your tactile system, right? It converts it into an electrochemical signal that your nervous system can understand. And so the only thing that your brain is getting is electrochemical signals, action potentials, right? Just nerve impulses. And your brain's job is, in a sense, to interpret those signals in a way that are meaningful to us. And this is really sort of leaving out this idea of, why is it even necessary that we have a conscious perception of it? Which is kind of a separate question, but to provide us this meaningful information. So what perception arguably is doing, or how it works, is it is your brain getting these incoming signals, which by the time they get there, they're in the form of electrochemical signals. They're not the same format that they were external to the body. And your brain has to make sense of them. And they're oftentimes very ambiguous. And so your brain presumably creates this reality for you, the perceiving entity, conscious thing, however you want to conceptualize that. And it generally matches what's happening in the outside world, but not always. And so, I think right now we see each other sitting across the table, and it's probably an accurate perception, right? You probably are sitting there, and you're probably the distance that my brain is telling me you are, so that if I were to reach out and, pull a piece of lint off your coat, I would reach to the right location and do that. But certainly we know from lots of, something as simple as an optical illusion, that we can misperceive what is out in front of us.
Is that usually the sensor is wrong, or is actually the sensor got the right signal, but my brain cannot process it?
Both can happen.
Both can happen.
So there are visual stimuli that are best explained by the biology of the sensory systems themselves. And so the way that, let's say, the layers of the retinal cells interact with each other, they might filter a message in such a way that the signal that gets sent to the brain is a slight mismatch with what's actually out in the world, right? And then there are other illusions that occur at the level of processing. And so you mentioned the McGurk effect before, and if any listeners are not familiar with that, the McGurk effect is this finding where if you record somebody, a visual recording of them saying the word, the syllable ga, G-A, and they say ga, 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 right? And then you make an auditory recording of them saying the syllables B-A, ba, ba, ba. And then you place the auditory recording of ba over the visual recording of ga, and people watch that visual recording, they will perceive an in-between experience, which is the D-A sound. So they'll perceive it as da, da, da. And the idea there is that, to get back to the original question, that's happening at the level of processing, right? So this is not an error at the sensory systems. It is, once all that information gets combined, oftentimes one of the big areas of sensory combination is in the thalamus. There's a lot of subcomponents to that, but it's your brain making sense of what is essentially an ambiguous stimulus. Because you see somebody's mouth moving, but you don't see their lips touching. And so your brain tells you they can't be making the ba sound, right? Because their lips have to touch to make the ba sound, right? And so, but you're hearing the ba sound. And so your brain just does its best guess and says, they must be making the DA sound, right? It must be da, because their lips aren't touching, but I'm hearing what sounds like BA. And you can do that with actually multiple different types of syllables, but that's a case of an illusion where that one is the result of ambiguous information.
So different sensors give you different perceptions of the world, and now you kind of fuse them together.
Yeah.
And it's possible one overrides the other, and it seems like it's also possible to merge them into a third, which is kind of in between.
And you're exactly right. And oftentimes, so our visual system is so dominant that if you look at the amount of cortical hardware that is devoted to processing sensory information, the number of areas and the amount of tissue in your cortex that is devoted to or is involved in visual processing, it combined makes up more tissue than all of your other senses put together. Right, so that our visual system is it is super complex, and it utilizes lots of different areas of the brain. And so anytime that you can get visual information, the visual information usually will take precedence over other sensory information because it is so rich and we have so much processing power devoted to it.
From the evolution point of view, why visioning, the sense of visioning is so important to us?
Well, I mean, this of course would be me.
Do we have richer proportion of vision connections compared to other animals?
We do. We don't have. It depends on what aspect of vision we're talking about. So in terms of, we certainly appear to have the best ability to process information that we're getting into our visual system, and that of course probably has a lot to do with our overall cognitive capabilities. But we probably have the best object recognition. Again, this is really difficult to say because that's a difficult thing to test in other animals, and you can't get a direct report from them. But there's this researcher, this guy named Ed Wasserman, who was at the University of Iowa most of his career, and he does a lot of work with pigeons and object recognition with pigeons, and has demonstrated some really impressive recognition capabilities in these birds that by other accounts do not seem to be incredibly intelligent, but they certainly have pretty advanced visual recognition abilities and discrimination abilities. Humans, we have pretty acute vision. We can see lots of details. We have not the best wavelength discrimination or color vision in the animal kingdom, but we're certainly in the upper echelon of color discrimination. And we seem to be able to, again, this is difficult to test, but we seem to be able to make sense of ambiguous visual stimuli very well.
So for animals, when they receive conflicting sensories, probably they have more trouble than us to tell what's going on.
Yeah, I would probably phrase it as it might just be less useful to them. Right, that we can utilize super degraded visual information and still make sense of what we're seeing. But in terms of comparisons between animals, so birds of prey, for example, their visual acuity vastly surpasses ours. An eagle, based on the physiology of their visual system and from some sort of observational testing, they can identify a field mouse from a mile in the air. Right, they can see it moving around down on the ground, whereas the resolution would be so poor for us at that distance that the likelihood of us detecting a mouse amongst a noisy background would be almost zero. Oh, right.
That actually brings me to another question. That is, if you play those kind of games on iPad, it's almost finding the difference between two pictures. And usually, it's very, very little tiny differences out of very complicated two background pictures. But somehow, how does our attention work when we do the perceptions?
So that's another great question, because attention obviously plays a role in what we perceive. And so what we do know is that when you present things to their sensory systems, there's this whole paradigm in cognitive psychology called inattentional blindness. And what happens is if you're looking at a scene and something in that scene changes very slowly while you're looking at it, unless you are focusing your attention directly on that part of the scene, you are highly likely to miss the change. Oh. And there are ones that, if you're looking at it, it seems plainly obvious. How could anybody miss this? There's one that I often show in class, and it's a farm scene, and there's these rows of corn in front, and an entire band of the corn just slowly disappears over the course of 15 seconds, and it's a very obvious change. But as you're scanning the screen and you're looking for this change, because you tell people something's going to change, you figure out what it is. And they're looking, and usually about 75-80% of people don't see the change. And then you rewind it and you show them again and you tell them, here's where it's at. And most people are stunned. How did I not see that? The interesting part about it is if you were to measure the response properties of somebody's retina and you measured the retinal cells that corresponded to that area of visual space where those cornrows were at, you would see that the activity of those retinal cells was changing as the cornrows were changing. So we are actually getting a physiological response at the sensory level that corresponds to the change in the external environment. But this is an important illustration where just because you're getting the sensory input does not equal perception, right? You fail to have a perception that something changed because likely attention was not devoted to that part of the sensory input. And so it shows that there is this relationship where it's not that everything that hits our sensory systems becomes part of our conscious perception. It's that there has to be some attention devoted to that, either intentionally so, or if it's something that we actually don't understand attention very well either. So if your attentional system can be driven by cues that are not voluntary, right? So we have what they might call exogenous cues to attention as well. And if something seems like a risk, right? If there was a loud screech outside the door right now, we would notice.
Without even consciously knowing something, we already have a reaction.
Yeah.
Right, when we sense that. So when we have the situation you just described, is there any pre-processing of the signal happening at the retina?
Yeah.
And then they just chose to say, hey, I'm not going to report this to my boss brain. Or actually the brain received all this and decided, I don't want to pay attention to that.
I think it probably has more to do with late selection, so that the information is making it to the brain, but there certainly is a lot of processing and filtering happening at the retinal level. So most physiologists would classify the retina as part of the central nervous system, right? So essentially it's an extension of, your brain.
It's weird, the brain is coming here instead of...
Right, and because it is such a complex web of neurons, right? So you have 5 layers of neurons in your retina, and even within those different types of neurons, there are subclasses within them, and they do different activities. That information, the visual signal, as it hits the photoreceptors, gets transduced into an electrochemical signal. It goes through the apparent utility of having these different layers is that the message gets filtered in such a way that it magnifies what is likely to be the important parts of the visual input, and it more or less eliminates the parts of the visual input that are unlikely to be useful.
So everybody is actually playing their part and trying to make the perception as accurate as possible.
Yeah. There's a really interesting phenomenon that occurs. It's called Mach bands, named after Ernst Mach, M-A-C-H. And Mach bands, what happens is it's the byproduct of the wiring of the cells in the retina, such that it's something called lateral inhibition, where if you strongly stimulate one set of cells, they will send an inhibitory signal to their neighboring cells that magnifies the difference in contrast between an edge. And truly, one of the major purposes of vision is to detect edges in the environment, to tell where you end and the background begins, right? Where this ends and the background begins, to segregate the things in your visual environment. So the wiring of your retina makes it more likely that my brain recognizes that there is an edge in my environment on the edge of this microphone relative to the background. Even if the two colors or the two luminances are really, really similar, a tiny difference is enough to trigger that lateral inhibition such that it magnifies that difference for my brain. In other words, it's your brain, your retina in this case, making edges more real than they actually are, or more apparent is probably a better term to use.
So it's higher contrast
Yeah.
Of image your brain is receiving compared to the real world.
That's exactly right.
Interesting.
Which so we know that's happening, and so of course you can do some retroactive theorizing and like why would it have ended up this way? And almost certainly because it provides an advantage, right? It makes our visual systems more useful to us because we are less likely to mistakenly interpret what we're seeing in the outside world.
Is that effect somehow exploited when people do 3D glasses? Is that the thing, or actually it's completely different? But also my general question is, what we see in the world, what do we perceive in the world? Is it 3D? Is it 2D? And also, why if I put on 3D glasses on a 2D movie, I feel so different? It's not even 2D or 3D. I kind of feel in between.
Okay. So again, these are excellent questions. If you think about it, the answer is kind of both the 2D and 3D question.
Mm-hmm.
So your retina is a two-dimensional surface. And even though as we look around this room right now, it's very easy for you to tell that I'm closer to you than the wall is, right? Even though if you were to look at your retina, this cardboard right behind me or this bulletin board on your retina is adjacent to my head. You know, on the picture on your retina. If we look at a photograph, it's the same thing. That when you look at a photograph, you can tell which things are closer or further from the camera, even though they're all on the exact same flat surface, the exact same distance from your eyes as you're looking at it. Well, your retina is essentially the same way. And your brain uses, there's a lot of different cues it uses, but there are a class of cues called pictorial cues that what your brain does is it just utilizes these shortcuts and says, if one thing is covering something else up, that thing is probably closer, right?
Oh.
If, you know, the shading plays a great deal in helping you figure out what things are closer to you or further from you. Linear perspective, right? So that as you look out into the world, even though you know that the edges of this room, we know this is a room with a bunch of right angles in it. And yet, if you sat down to draw this room on a piece of paper from your perspective, you wouldn't draw the lines in the ceiling parallel on the page. You would angle them so that they looked three-dimensional. Right? And what we're really doing there, and if you look at art history, you can see that there's a point at which we learned this, that what you have to do to make a painting look realistic is you have to actually warp all the angles in the same way that they appear when they land on your retina. Right? So the two lines of the ceiling in this room, the way that they're landing on my retina are actually like this, right? It's not parallel lines on my retina. It's like this, and my brain then takes those lines that are converging and tells me, oh, even though they're converging on the retinal surface, that means they're parallel in the real world.
So almost the brain is doing geometry implicitly.
Yes.
Just to project everything back.
That's exactly right.
So is it fair then to say, or has people measured this, that when things get further from you, basically you have a wrong sense of distance?
Well,
like how wide something is.
It depends on what we mean by further. We are actually really good at judging distances when they are on a plane, right? So when we look out, if you go up to Grandad Bluff and you look up or down the river, people are pretty good at making a guess at how far away that bluff is, right? How far down can I see? But you look up at the stars? No, right? You look up at the clouds, you look at the moon. People are very, very bad at making judgments of distance when we are outside of really, what would have certainly been the ecological environment during the evolution of the visual system. That there is no confirmation on how far away those things are, whereas throughout all of evolutionary history, that as organisms that had visual systems were making judgments about the distance of things on land, they could confirm whether they were right or not, right? To help calibrate that programming. You know, this thing is coming towards me. Do I need to run now or do I have some time? You know,
very important.
Yeah.
So, do we need both eyes in order to tell the difference? Or I kind of feel like I tried that. One eye is good enough.
So this goes back to your three-dimensionality question. Certainly one of the major advantages of having two eyes separated in space is binocular rivalry, binocular vision. And what's essentially happening is you're getting just slightly different inputs into the two eyes. And of course, the closer the thing is that you're looking at, the bigger the difference between the two eyes. One way you can do that, and I know this doesn't probably translate great to a podcast, but if you hold your finger straight out in front of your nose sideways like this, and maybe a foot in front of you, and close one eye, then the other eye, one eye, then the other eye, and take note of how much of your fingernail you can see with each eye, and you notice it's fairly different. Right?
Definitely.
But if you were looking at something, let's just say that you're looking at, Grandad Bluff, and you're a half a mile away from it, that the input from one eye to the other eye is nearly identical. I mean, because it is so far away that you're getting almost no difference whatsoever, which means that binocular disparity doesn't provide as good of a depth cue for things that are farther away from you. It provides tremendous depth cues for things that are in your very close proximity. Right? So I frequently use the example of, if you want to see how important your binocular disparity is, cover one eye and try to play ping pong. Right? It makes it very difficult to judge where that ball is and the speed at which it's moving because it's all in this close proximity to you that it makes it really hard. Here, I mean, another example, if I just ask you right now, close one eye, take your two fingers like this out in front of you and touch them together.
Yeah, it's strange because I feel like they're on the same plane, but I feel like this one is actually further.
But if
But
you do
actually they touched. But in my vision, I feel like this one is actually way behind.
Sure, and if you do it with your eyes open, people do it correctly the first time, almost every time.
Yeah.
But as soon as you close one eye, people start making mistakes.
Interesting. So I also, back to the ping pong example, when I was playing baseball, actually the first thing our coach asked us to actually try to see which eye is actually the sharper eye by basically drawing a circle. Okay, I see something and then close one eye. You can only see it with one eye.
Yep.
Instead of the other. So does these two eyes actually have difference when we start to tell the thing you just was trying to say? If this is my dominant eye, can I play ping pong with this? But it's harder for me to play with this, or actually it's.
I actually don't know. I mean, your coach was correct about almost everybody does have a dominant eye, and it tends to be correlated with what we might call handedness. So generally, if somebody has a dominant right eye, they generally are right-handed as well, and they might have a dominant right leg. But it's actually not as binary as people think. Most people have some level of ambidexterity. It's just that we really focus on what hand do you write with, what hand do you feed yourself with. But in reality, people have quite varying degrees of handedness. And we tend to just lump it into right-handed, left-handed. But the eye dominance, I don't really know. I would argue that the information you get from having two eyes open is far more important than the dominance of one eye versus the other. So even if you were just slightly better, let's just say less bad with your one dominant eye open versus your non-dominant eye, I think you're still going to notice a serious decrement in your ability if you have one of your eyes closed, regardless of which eye.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So another thing I actually have, I'm wondering is when I'm reading some papers on artificial intelligence for the computer, it's really hard for them to do object detection with fewer data simply because they need to scan the whole picture. But somehow I read for human, actually, the moment we see part of the picture, our eyes automatically knows where next to look at in order to recognize what object it is. And our eye roughly shift positions for 3 times per second to just recognize objects. And how does that thing work? How do we know where to look next to see the object?
Okay, so the how do we know, I'll answer that part first, is I would argue that it's not necessarily some inherent we know where to look, but there's regularities in our visual environment, and you probably learn pretty quickly, any organism does, on the things that you're looking at. Where could you focus on this object to get the most useful information in the quickest amount of time possible?
Does it vary by object?
Yeah, it would.
Wow, that's a big database.
It is. So what you're describing there, this is something that's really interesting about the distinction between research on human object recognition and computer vision, and I think the two seem to be coming together, more and more all the time. But my understanding is that some of the initial computer vision projects that were developed 40 years ago were mostly based around what we would call a template theory, where you essentially fed the computer a bunch of different images, right? Here's a chair, here's a different view of a chair, here's a different view of a chair. And then the camera on the computer picks up the visual input, and it just runs a quick algorithm to look for the closest match, right? Oh, that doesn't match any of my bicycle pictures, right? But it does seem to match this chair picture, even if it's not a perfect match because it's a slightly different angle. It's the best match we can find. It's probably a chair. Whereas if you propose a system like that for humans, it makes certain predictions that are not borne out by the data, right? And so one of them is that you would have to have a tremendously large number of representations stored in memory to recognize even a single object. Because we can recognize objects. I'm holding my sunglasses up. If I hold them like this, you can tell they're sunglasses. If I hold them like that, you can. If I hold them like that, you can. But every single one of those is a very different visual input on your retina. And so presumably, if we were using pictures or templates, you would have to have a picture stored like this, and like that, and like that, right? And that just doesn't seem very efficient, right? And computationally, you should see a decrease in recognition speed if you present somebody a novel angle of an object that they have just learned, right? So if you learned that that's what sunglasses look like, and then I test you with this, it should take you measurably longer, even if it's a tiny bit of time, right? And that's not the case. That we don't see a decrement when you rotate objects unless you get some really particular viewpoint that makes it so that you can't identify parts. So probably the leading theories right now on how humans recognize objects is by using something called a structural description, where you have this alphabet essentially of shapes, of basic shapes stored in your memory.
Geometric shapes?
Yep.
Well, good.
So three-dimensional shapes. Different researchers have proposed different models of these shapes. So it started out with a term called generalized cylinders. There's a researcher named Irv Biederman, and he proposed this set that he called geons, or geometrical ions. And they're basically just three-dimensional shapes, and he proposed a set of 36 of them. He came up with this idea based off of if you take any given solid object and you think about the ways in which you could alter that object to make it into a different object, there are certain parameters. There are 4 different parameters on which you could change it, right? So like you let's say you have a Pringles can, right? And you slice that Pringles can and you look at where you sliced it. What does the cross section look like? Is it round? Does it have round edges or straight edges? Is it symmetrical at a 90-degree turn? Is it symmetrical at a 180-degree turn? Is it asymmetrical? You look at the axis of the Pringles can, and a can would be straight, but a macaroni noodle would be curved axis. As it goes along the axis, does it stay the same length like the Pringles can, or does it get longer like a cone, or does it get longer and then shorter like a lemon? And then you take all of these parameters and you put them together, and he came up with this set of 36 different possible shapes. The actual number is probably less important than the theory, where what he's saying is that all you need is a cluster of cells. Oftentimes these are in the lower side of our temporal lobe, is where we see the activation patterns, that when I see a cube, a certain cluster of cells becomes active. Right? When I see a curved cylinder, a different cluster of cells becomes active. And then if you can just activate this cluster of cells, like an alphabet, as well as the spatial orientation between those parts to one another. So take a coffee mug, for example. You have a cylinder, and you have a curved cylinder to the side of it. Right? Well, the advantage of this is I look at a coffee mug, it activates the cells in my temporal lobe that represent cylinder, it activates the cells that represent curved cylinder, and it activates a set of cells that correspond to this side of relationship. Now, any coffee mug I encounter, any coffee mug that is a cylinder to the side of a curved cylinder will activate that same representation, and I will recognize it.
Wow.
And it doesn't matter if it's at a slightly different angle, as long as the parts and the spatial representation are activated, I will recognize it.
But you're talking about the representation not of the coffee mug, but for the concept of coffee mug, right?
Yes.
Because different coffee mug have a different color, different size, but you're just saying, okay, now I recognize them at a very general and abstract level.
That's right. And so what this does is this solves this ability where if you came in here today and you had a friend who made you a coffee mug in pottery class, and I had never seen that coffee mug before, but it had a cylinder to the side of a curved cylinder, I would immediately know what it was. And if you actually presented that to me on a computer screen and you were measuring my reaction time would be just as fast as if you showed me my coffee mug that I use every single morning. If you rotated the mug and showed it to me from a different angle, I would also recognize it. If you covered up part of the coffee mug, but you covered it up in such a way that I could still figure out what are the shapes and how are they spatially related to each other, I'll still recognize it with an equal expediency.
That reminded me of the famous painting by Picasso about a bull. It's like a bull, and he's basically saying, what makes people think a bull is a bull? Right, so he started actually draw like a 3-dimensional bull, very rich, and then he started remove this and that. Finally, he ended up with like a geometric shape with only like a circle and a cylinder and 2 straight lines, and people have no problem recognizing that's actually a bull, even though that's so simplified.
Yeah.
And turns out actually the shadow on the ground matters more than the muscles.
Yeah.
You need to have a shadow there, so that makes sense to me. But then, how can we tell the difference? For example, let's say human faces.
Yeah.
I can certainly recognize you're a human being. Okay, but I can probably memorize 1,000 or 500 different human faces and recognize them really quickly. So based on what you just said, do we do it after we recognize you're a human being and then do it, or actually do we have another mechanics to work for faces?
That's perfect, right? So you nailed down a question that sometimes it takes students a semester to get to, right? That this idea that we have this generalized system that solves all these problems. It lets us recognize new examples of objects we've never seen before. Coffee mug I've never seen, a pickup truck I've never seen. We can recognize coffee mugs from any angle. We can recognize coffee mugs that are partially covered up. These are all things we know to be true about human recognition, and this structural description theory can explain how it happens. What it doesn't explain is how I can tell the difference between two human faces that have the exact same parts arranged in the same ways. Because two faces should theoretically activate the exact same neural pattern according to what I just described. And so, as it turns out, you have this little tiny area in your right temporal lobe called it's called the fusiform face area, and it's on this little bulb called the fusiform gyrus on the other underside of your right temporal lobe. And when people are making discriminations between two objects that have the same parts arranged in the same ways, we see activation of that little part of the brain. And it is happening simultaneously, right? So it is not a serial process where you first recognize what the basic level of the object is and then you go on to this next step. It depends on the task, right? So if from the outset you know that the task is I have to discriminate these things, I have to identify your face versus somebody else's, you get parallel processing, right? So you're simultaneously activating, oh, it is a face, and which face is it, right? I need to discriminate between these different possibilities. So there's a disorder where if somebody damages that part of their brain, and it most often happens as a result of a stroke, called prosopagnosia. And the translation of that very roughly is lack of knowledge of faces. And prosopagnosics, they are incapable of visually discriminating between two objects that have the same parts arranged in the same way, spatially. So they can't tell two faces apart, but they also can't tell two flowers apart, or two pickup trucks apart, or two buildings that are roughly the same apart. They can't recognize their own face in a photograph. But if you let them watch a familiar person walk, they can identify the person based on their gait pattern. They can identify the person based on a really bizarre hairdo that basically makes another feature, right? If somebody has, they can tell their voices still, right? They have no problem identifying people on the phone that they've always been able to identify. It's a visual discrimination deficit as a result of damaging that little area in the fusiform gyrus. And if you acquire it as the result of a stroke or other type of damage, there is no evidence that you ever get it back. Right? People learn coping mechanisms on how to deal with it, right? So they might ask their family members, oh, I have two sons, I'm going to ask this one to always wear like a pin so I can tell them apart, right? Or to always...
So based on some other features.
Yeah.
I see. Interesting. So with that in mind, if let's assume the theory is right, 36 or some objects, it seems like, are we born with those? Or do we actually try to get that? Because it seems like it's more convenient to just see if it's 36 or whatever number. Yeah. Let's just inherit our gene.
So this is something that actually I have done some research on, because I'm curious about the same thing. Is that alphabet of 36 actually the set of representations that people have?
That's archetypes, right? We can totally plant into our genes.
Yeah, I would argue that no, I think that it probably has a lot more to do with experience with the visual world and just regularities in the visual environment. And that it probably, there is evidence that if somebody spends a lot of time working on a visual task that requires a certain type of discrimination, that perhaps they can refine that alphabet to some degree, where maybe they can make a distinction more easily than the rest of us between two pretty similar objects without recruiting that special area, that special discrimination area. It's an ongoing question. I mean, people are still researching this right now, that do we have specialized cells just for these shapes, right? Or do we have specialized cells just for faces? There's now an area called the parahippocampal place area in the brain, and we see that when you're identifying like scenes of places, we see activation in that part of the brain. But to answer your question more specifically, what we do know is that people who have their brains fully intact, and they do still have that fusiform face area, that you can learn to discriminate between classes of visual stimuli with experience. And so take chicken sexers, for example, so taking a chick and having to look at the underside of it and figure out if it's a male or a female chick. apparently that's an incredibly hard thing to do for a novice, that you just can't even tell. But somebody who has done it for a long period of time, they can do it in a half a second. They can just glance and they know immediately with a huge degree of accuracy. Well, their visual system from the external point of view is not different, right? Their eyeballs are exactly the same as ours. It must necessarily be some refining of that discrimination ability, right? Where they are honing in on exactly what to focus on. There's a researcher who actually was my graduate school advisor named Eric Cooper, and he wrote a paper. He has a really elegant theory about this called the coordinate relations hypothesis, and he argues that what's happening is that when you look at a face, you can think of it as if there's like graph paper. Okay. Right? And I put your face on a piece of graph paper and my face on a piece of graph paper. And when we look at it in that way, what we see is that, oh, maybe my eyes are a tiny bit further apart, or my nose is a tiny bit longer. And by making those direct comparisons and saying, here's a central fixation point, and my eyebrow is 2 units to the right and 2 units up, and your eyebrow is 3 units to the right and 2 units up, that your brain can make that direct comparison. Well, the argument being that if you get really, really experienced at some sort of discrimination task, that your graph paper gets finer, right? So that now you and I might not be able to tell the difference between a male and a female chick, but if we had graph paper with really, really fine mesh, then we can zero in on, oh, there's this little tiny difference right there. That's how you're able to tell.
So it's almost like training a sniper.
I suppose, yeah.
But then we start to talk about where the computer visioning comes in, right? Because they're really good at picking those kind of subtle differences. Is this ability conscious or unconscious? Like, do you realize you become better, and do you need to activate it and say, I want to use my superpower now?
No, I would say by that definition that you just gave, it is not a conscious effort. It is the feedback that comes from experience, right? And you have to. I think that as you're training the system via experience, that you probably have to get some feedback about whether you were correct or not.
Constantly, yeah.
But no, I don't think it is something where we actively tell ourselves, like, I want to be better at this, or I want to pay more attention to it. I think it is almost certainly just a byproduct of experience. That the more experience you have with it, the better you become at it.
That's so interesting. So it's almost like a muscle training compared to studying or learning.
And I will say also, just to be inclusive of all the research out there, that when I mentioned prosopagnosia a little bit ago, the research that was dominant in the field for many years was about what we call acquired prosopagnosia, so people getting it as a result of some sort of damage to the brain. But there is an emerging field over the last 20 years called developmental prosopagnosia. And there's this researcher named Brad Duchesne in Great Britain that has done a lot of research on this and has identified that in reality, even without any brain damage whatsoever, our ability to make those fine-tuned visual discriminations probably falls on a normal distribution. And most of us are somewhere right in the middle where we're pretty good at making discriminations, but not great. And it looks like with some training, we can get better at certain tasks. But there does seem to be people who are just really, really poor at it. And they're down on the lower end of that distribution. And I think that there are some neuroimaging studies that have shown that there is actually less activation in their brains in that fusiform face area. And they really have trouble discriminating between. The reason it always focuses on faces is because that's the most obvious deficit for most people. We rarely, get into some big issue about, I couldn't tell these flowers apart, right? But if you can't tell people's faces apart, it's noticeable right away. And that's how the disorder got the name prosopagnosia, referring to faces, when in reality it's not just faces. Is it
binary, or actually it's just like I become bad at telling faces, or it's just like, okay, it's either I can tell the difference or I cannot?
You mean when people acquire it?
When people acquire it, it's just like I completely lost the ability to tell the difference. Or actually, okay, if you guys look similar, like I couldn't tell the twins apart, or like brothers apart, but I can still tell very different people with different race or color or apart.
That's a great question. It seems to be highly correlated with the extent of the damage to that part of the brain. So if you really destroy, a whole bunch of the tissue down near that area, I think that you might call it binary, right? It gets to the point where it's just like, nope, you just cannot make that discrimination. Even if I give you the two pictures side by side and you get to look back and forth, it's still nearly impossible. They're basically a chance at determining were those the same face or different faces. But there is evidence that you can have, less
like
damage to it.
0.3.
Yeah, and that it just becomes a more difficult task for you. Certainly things like race, if the skin color is significantly different, there is some ability there to make a discrimination. And again, it depends on the task. If the task is just, are these the same or different, that's a little bit easier than, who is this?
Yeah.
Right? Even if it's a series of famous faces that somebody should know, that's where it becomes really, really difficult. Right? Because the figuring, like matching that pattern to a memory, you can ask a prosopagnostics, who was the president in, on 9/11, and they can tell you their semantic and episodic memories are totally intact. But if you showed them pictures of 5 presidents, no, they wouldn't be able to. Very unlikely that they would be able to tell. So like matching the visual input to something they know, right? That generally is gone.
Interesting. Another interesting thing I read about perceptions, which is connected to consciousness or cognitions, is our understanding from language can affect our perception. Seems like, if I remember correctly, it's Russian. In the Russian language, they don't have a single word for blue. They have different words for 5 different kind of blues. And turns out people did some experiment with that and see like the Russian people are just good at telling different type of blues simply because they don't have a unified word called blue. They don't say sky is blue. They always say the sky is dark blue or navy blue all the time. So is that something like, you can elaborate on like our language or our perceptions from other things can affect our abilities to do perceptions?
Yes. So that's funny. I actually did a research project in graduate school where I was looking at that exact question of whether or not, so there were these 2 researchers, Berlin and Kay, and they proposed this theory that if your language does not have a word for a particular color, that you are less inclined to be able to discriminate that color from other colors, right? I don't think they went quite so far as to say you can't see that color, right? But really to say that if there's no distinction between blue and purple in the language that you have grown in and that that you are less inclined or even less able to discriminate blue from purple. And an extreme version of this is referred to as the Whorfian hypothesis, and this is sort of a linguistic theory that says that language shapes our thoughts. And certainly I think there's validity to that, but I think it probably depends on what aspect of perception we're talking about. So the research project I did is, I was just naturally sort of skeptical about that whole idea, thinking that given the hardware of how our eyes work, right, the actual physiology of our visual system, that your photoreceptors respond differently to 400 nanometer light, 400 wavelength light versus 480 nanometer wavelength light, that it causes a different neural pattern. Now, it certainly could be the case that if you have lived your entire life and have never had any utility for attending to how those 2 different patterns coming into your retina are useful, that you might just devote less attention to it, right? But that's not the same thing as saying if I put a blue patch and a purple patch in front of you and I asked you, are these identical or not identical, would you be able to do it? And my argument was, I would think anybody would be able to, even if you didn't have a word to separate the 2. Right?
Or after some trainings, you don't have the word, simply it means you didn't tell the difference before, but now if it's required, given 20 practice or something like that, then you will be able to start to say it. Okay.
So the way I tested it, I actually recruited a whole bunch of colorblind participants and did this experiment where I chose some primary colors, basically like colors of the rainbow. And so I would put, let's just say, a blue patch on one side of the screen and a green patch on the other side of the screen. And then in equal increments, I got every single color in between the 2 of those. And so there might have been 120 increments in between blue and green. And so number 1 was basically green, right? It looked identical to this one, right? And the last one, 120, was basically blue. And it was every level in between there. And then what I did is I would present in random order one of those 120 middle colors, and you had the blue and green patches up on the screen. Of course, I counterbalanced, so there was no preference. But and ask people, which one does it look more like? Right? You can sit there and study them, and you just decide for yourself which one does it appear to be most like. And you just had two buttons. It looks more like that one, more like that one. And then if you plot the results, what you see is starting with green here and blue there, and then you along the bottom we have a band that shows super green, and it slowly moves towards blue, right? And what you find is that when it's this green, everybody says it looks like this, right? And then as you move away, you get this sort of S curve, right? Where over here, everything looks blue, right? Everything looks green. And this little crossover point is the point of subjective equality, where you think those middle ones look equally like the two. Well, I tested that on people with normal color vision, and I tested the same thing on people with color vision deficiencies or color blindness, and they all had the same type of color blindness. And the point of that was to show that we know that colorblind people have different visual hardware than people with normal color vision. Right? I mean, that's a physiological fact, is that their visual system, their retinas work in a different way than ours do. And the consequence of that different biology is a different perception of the world. And so what I wanted to show is that this test that I had developed was capable of identifying when people perceived the world in a different way, right? In particular, perceived color in a different way. So if my regular vision people and my colorblind people scored differently on this, that would provide evidence that this particular test is capable of showing that one group of people perceives the world one way and a different group of people perceives it a different way. And then I actually followed that up with, instead of using colors as the anchors, I just used words written in black, blue, green, and let people make their own judgment of what they thought blue and green was with those middle items, and found this exact same results, that the colorblind people and regular vision differed in their crossover point. And now, so that was like for thesis work in graduate school. Mm-hmm. The goal of that was to establish a test. It's still sort of sitting in my file drawer in terms of, I would love to take it to some countries where we could find indigenous peoples who don't have the same color language that we do, right? So that I could then test it on them. Now that I have established that the test is capable of discriminating between people who see the world differently, let's test it on people who have different language and see if we can, do they really see colors differently than we do, even if they have different color words.
Interesting. So at least one valid explanation I get from you is just, you just never pay attention to this task. But then further things can be tested once you start to take that thing out of your file pile and start to really test it, right?
And the interesting part about that, what I really liked about that project, is all of the research that had been done at that time, and I think even now, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up on this. Anytime you tested people in these language scenarios, does language shape your color perception? They would use color terms. Right? So Berlin and Kay, they're the ones who had this famous initial study where they argued that language influences color perception. Well, they put labels on all the colors, and they said, make a blue pile, make a green pile, and they had these color chips. Well, the language is what's doing the biasing, right? Mm-hmm. And so the whole goal was to create a test that had no words in it, right? And that way we can just truly test the perceptual differences between these groups, totally devoid of any language reference whatsoever, and see physiologically, does their brain respond in a different way than our brain does.
Yeah. After giving this some thought, when you say blue, and there is another language, and they have a word, but the best you can do is translate it to be blue, but actually it means something else. Interesting. Okay, so I don't know if this is related with perceptions, right? So you were talking about different sensories receive different signals come together. And it seems like human can make metaphors to a really ridiculous level. That is like, when you play piano, they say play like a butterfly. Or, when you see some people smiling, you say they smile like a sunshine, things like that. So does it have anything to do with perceptions? Because we have such rich perception?
This is one area where
let's say, I think I can phrase it better. It's just like when I say she smiles like sunshine, do I actually activate my visual cortex related to sunshine?
I don't know. That the closest thing that I'm familiar with in that discussion would be this phenomenon known as synesthesia, and that is where you get this crossover of sensory, perceptual experiences usually as the result of one sensory input. But let me address your question first before I go into anything on that. So what you're asking is an empirical question, right? That is something we could pretty easily answer, right? By actually measuring people's brain activity and then giving them metaphors that involve multiple senses and see if, and you would have to be clever about designing it, because if I asked you to, if I said I want you to envision this person's smile, well, if I really ask you to think about somebody smiling, I probably will see visual cortex activity, because you'll be thinking about, especially if I tell you a specific person, right? If I say I want you to, think about a family member that you care about smiling, right? Well, you're probably going to visualize them, and we know that if I ask you to visualize anything, you're going to see visual cortex activity. And so it might be a useful approach to find a metaphor that includes two separate senses, right? And see if you can,
like you smell like blue.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's actually a great example there, is like people do understand metaphors in a way, though, that is quite fascinating. So you say, it seems hard to believe that it could all just be learned. I think if I said I'm feeling blue today, people know what I mean, but that might just be culturally, imbued, right? Like we have learned blue means they're feeling down, they're feeling, less happy. But when somebody describes an experience they had and they use a metaphor that somebody's never heard before, generally we understand them, and
I'm hunger for knowledge.
Yeah.
I know hungry, and you're talking about knowledge, so yeah, I kind of follow what you mean by that.
And this is a hard one to disambiguate, right? Because when we talk about sharp cheese, it's hard to know, is this just an intuitive understanding, or is it because we have just learned what sharp cheese means over our lives? I mean, and everybody knows we're not talking about cheese that could cut you. When you talk about a loud shirt, right? Oh, yeah, on a really loud shirt. Is it that we really have this inherent, overlap, or is it that you have just learned over time, loud just means it was visually very, in your face? Although there is some evidence, this is purely anecdotal, but I have a 7-year-old, and we have a piano, and we were, when he was very young, probably 2.5 years old, 3 years old maybe, my wife was kind of messing around on it. She's playing different chords, and when she would play minor chords, he talked about them being darker. He said, play the darker ones again, right? And it was unrelated to the octave in which he was playing. It was the chords, a minor versus a major, that he was referring to the major chords as brighter and the minor chords as darker, which, I don't remember ever having said that in front of him, but it does illustrate this idea, like, why is he describing a sound with a visual description? Which suggests that maybe we do all have some inherent mixing of our senses that enable us to use metaphors in a way that are meaningful and original.
You would think, like, for audios we have a set of word and set of cortex, and for visuals we have a set of cortex and set of words, and they never go together. But it seems like, yeah, you can somehow go cross them and still people can get it. Do people actually feel it? Because I watched Big Bang Theory the other day, and he said, like, Sheldon just look at the screen and say, I found a pattern. And I said, how could you do it? He said, how the prime numbers are pink?
Right.
And that's kind of remind me of a different thing, though, but maybe he actually sees that thing as pink.
So this is an area that I just recently finished a project with some students when we presented these findings at a conference. So what Sheldon in that example is describing is something called color grapheme synesthesia, and there are vastly differing estimates on how many people in the population experience this. It's anywhere from, I think, somewhere like 1% up to, like, I've seen estimates as high as 4% of the population have this experience.
So that's not even too rare.
No.
Huh.
When I mentioned this in our general psych class that usually has between 400 and 500 students, I almost always have a student or two who comes up and says, I have that experience.
Seeing a number?
So what they do is they see their graphemes, meaning their numbers and letters, that each one has a certain color associated with it. And there are different degrees of association depending on what we might call the severity of this person's synesthesia.
So hold on, just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So it's on a paper. You have black printed
Yep.
color and letter. They literally see difference when they see the color.
So the first part of what you're saying is correct, that you show them a book, words on a screen, anything, doesn't matter what color the text is, they will say, my 3s are always green, even though I can tell you it's printed in black or it's white up on the screen. But they say, I perceive it as green. There are different levels of this where some people will say, it's green out there.
On the screen.
On the screen. And other people will say, well, no, I know that it's black, but I just have this feeling of green. And they oftentimes have a really hard time actually describing it, right? If you press them on it and say, well, what do you mean exactly? They're like, I don't know. It's just green. So... and there's a researcher named V.S. Ramachandran who's done a whole bunch of research on this, and he has made a distinction between, what were the two terms he used? Projectors and associators. And a projector's synesthete is somebody who actually perceives it in the outside world, right? An associator is somebody who can tell you, no, I know what color it actually is, but I have this really, really strong experience of green when I'm looking at it. And they'll still say, as I read, it is as if the letters are colored, but I know they're not colored out there on the page, right? I know that it's in here, but
That's
they still
insane,
have it.
Yeah.
And so the example with Sheldon having a pop-out effect where the items on the screen make a pattern, that would be a projector, and that seems to be more rare. But
Is a projector just a stronger associator?
Well, there are different theories. One is that it's just a stronger association. We think that what's happening is you have these excessive connections in the thalamus where almost all of your sensory systems go initially from the sensory neurons before they go to the cortex for conscious awareness. And everybody has this sort of way station in the thalamus where everything comes in, and what we think's happening is that synesthetes have an excessive number of neural connections where an auditory signal comes in from your cochlea, and even though it's only supposed to go from the thalamus back out to the primary auditory cortex and the temporal lobes, that because of those excessive connections in the thalamus, some of the signal gets sent to the occipital lobe. And so every time I hear a tone, I get a corresponding visual experience that is completely involuntary, right? Because it's all hardwired. And so every time I hear an A key on a piano, I see red in my visual field, and it decays at the same rate that the sound decays.
So that's a leak of signal.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's just basically it's I wouldn't say miswiring so much as like excessive wiring.
Yeah.
And so one theory is that projectors have just a super dense amount of excessive wiring in there. And another theory is that it actually is recruiting a different part of the system that because think of it this way. So can I use your paper for a sec? Do you have a pen?
Actually, I don't. But
so
we have to go with this is a podcast. So.
Okay, great. Well, here's what I was going to do. Is what you can do is you can write the numbers 12, 13, 14 down, and then you can write the letters A, B, and C, and you make the 13 the B.
Okay.
Right, and so you could draw the 13 such
13
that
in the middle, so
Yep.
A, B, C, and the 12,
Yep.
13. So the one in the middle is kind of ambiguous.
That's correct.
Okay.
And if you find a synesthete who says, my letter B is this color, but my 1 and my 3 are this color, and they're not the same, that their perception will change depending on which direction you let them see that. Which, in that case, that provides evidence that the person is an associator, because it is not the physical shape of the object that is causing a hardwired color response. Instead, it is the meaning of the object that then creates an association that then leads to the experience.
So category decides what you see.
That's right. And so in that case, it shouldn't matter for that person what kind of handwriting they see. As long as they interpret it as a B, they're going to get the same color. Whereas a projector, like the Sheldon example, that in order for it to pop out, because if you're familiar with the difference between a serial search task and the pop-out effect necessitates that there is a visual difference between the objects that draws your attention, right? Versus having to find the meaning before you get the color would require a serial search, right? Because you would have to individually look at each item before you could get the meaning. You'd have to put it in foveal vision. That's a B. Now it's red.
That's
right?
clever.
And so what Ramachandran did, he did a pop-out test like that, and the pop-out test presumably identifies projectors, not associators.
Okay.
right? And so it's one way to separate that out. So I actually, the project I worked on with these students is there's another test that has been widely used in the synesthesia literature, and it's uses something called it's a Stroop-like task, and essentially it amounts to, if you tell me that your A's are red, then what should happen is, if I put a red square on the screen, let's say that I have a computer screen in front of you, and I'm going to put up 4 possible squares on the screen, one at a time: red, blue, yellow, or green. And you have 4 buttons in front of you, and your job is just to press the button that corresponds to the color as fast as you possibly can. Just simple reaction time. I could establish a baseline for you. But let's just say that before I put the color red up, I flash the word red on the screen very briefly. And I prime you, right? I get you ready thinking, oh, it's going to be red, that I can speed up how quickly you can hit the red button, right? So I put the word red up for a 1/10 of a second, and then a 1/2 a second later, the color red pops up. You're going to be faster at hitting the red button, right? Simple priming. Yep. If, on the other hand, I put the word red up and I put the color blue after that, and your job is to press the button that corresponds to the color, the patch, right? It will actually slow you down. It will cause interference. So now you're going to respond slower than your baseline reaction time.
Or you'll make a mistake. Yeah, one way or the other.
Right. And you can set it up. Yeah, exactly. And so researchers have used this by saying, you tell me what your grapheme colors are. And so you come to me and you say, okay, my A's are red. Well, now what I can do, presumably, is I can put an A up on the screen. I can measure your reaction times, right? Find your baseline, but then I can prime you with an A, and that should make you faster at pressing the red button, right? And if you tell me your B's are blue, that should make you, right?
Yeah.
So that's been used, and people have basically accepted it as evidence showing that grapheme color synesthesia is present in a particular participant.
So hold on. So the outcome of the example you just said, like they showed exactly the identical effect as when you actually show the word red.
Yeah, I mean, they show a facilitation effect, right? I don't know if you could say it's exactly the same, but it definitely is significantly faster at responding. And if you show them an A, which they call red, and you follow that with a blue patch, it inhibits their response time, right? Slows them down. Now, my natural skeptical mind said, well, hold on a minute. I can do that with a word. And if I can do it with a word, the word green before the patch green, I don't see green when you put the word green up on the screen, right? It activates a meaning for me. And that makes me faster at pressing the green button. So my argument, my concern was that all of these studies that have been published that have used that method, arguably, you could learn an association between an A and the color red.
The same as learning green.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, and even though I don't think people are sitting around and trying to learn an association with a color with a certain letter, the fact that it could happen tells me that that is not a legitimate or a reliable test for the presence of synesthesia. So what we did is we recruited a whole bunch of Psych 100 students, and we made them come into our lab for 13 different training sessions and made them sit down and learn associations between colors and letters by doing a simple classical conditioning task where it was an item popped up on the screen and they had to press the button. Before long, they were very good at knowing that this letter meant this color, this letter meant this color. We chose letters not associated with any color, like K was associated with, I think we did like a light blue color, right? Right. and then we tested them using the same test that these researchers had used on synesthetes, and our trained synesthetes, right, the ones that we made up, they produced the same pattern of results as somebody who presumably had real synesthesia.
So it's purely a priming effect.
That's my argument.
According to what you're trying to show here, right?
And
so it's possible some of the students who become super excited, like letter B just means green for me, simply because maybe when you are a kid, the first time you saw a B and the B was green, and starting from there, maybe you see it several times, and now that's implanted, and that's become green in your mind, possibly.
You know, it's hard. I think that's certainly possible. There's a study that was published that there's a company called Fisher-Price, and they make these magnets that are letters that you can put on refrigerators, and they were really popular in the late 70s and early 80s. Many people who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s even will say, yeah, I had a set of those when I was a kid. There are these two researchers who combed through a whole bunch of synesthetes, grapheme color synesthetes, and they found a tremendous overlap with the letters that people, the colors and letter matches that people had, and it was even stronger for people in that age range.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So arguing there might be some learned component to it, which strengthens the argument I'm making. And I'll be clear, and this is we're actually writing this paper up right now, that I don't think that this means that the people in those studies are not synesthetic. I'm just arguing that's not a great test to use.
That's not
right?
the only possibility.
Right. We should probably be more careful in our methodology, because right now the synesthesia literature is kind of all over the place in terms of methodology, because, you know, for a long time it wasn't really taken that seriously as a legitimate scientific topic in neuroscience, and it has gained a lot of popularity in the last 20, 25 years. And so one of the things we want to do is try to follow that up and develop a test of our own that is less likely to be, you know, it's less likely to falsely identify somebody as synesthetic if, in fact, it's just a learned association that they had.
Are there any similar study done for the projectors?
I don't know. You mean ones that have tried to...
Yeah, this one is more for the associations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but for projectors, are there anything to show somehow, yeah, maybe you think it's a rare thing or biological thing, but that thing actually can be trained?
I am not familiar with any literature that has been able to poke holes in that, and only because the projectors, some of the things that they are able to do, like that search task, it is really hard to explain how that could happen in any other way except that they really are perceiving the display differently, right? That there's some attribute of that visual input that triggers a response in their brain without meaning, right? So like if I show you a big display and it's covered in circles and there's a couple of triangles, you do not need to scan it, right? That the visual attributes of those few triangles will draw your attention naturally, and you'll be like, there, right? There's 4 triangles in it. And that presumably, and that ability is showing that there's something that the visual attributes of that are activating a part of your brain that draws your attention without your intention, right? Without your volition to do it. And that a projector is having a similar experience. That I put a whole bunch of, you know, 5s and 2s or whatever on a screen, and for most of us it takes a long time to find them, but for them there's something about the visual attribute that triggers a part of their brain that draws their attention to it. And what they say is that it looks like a different color from everything else.
Wow. Yeah, because automatically I reflect on that. If association is trainable, I mean, just think about mathematics. Like I can flash the prime numbers with students and then say, somehow I want to train you to next time you see a prime number, you are going to see it's green. Yeah. And then now I give you a paper full of numbers and you automatically just pop up. Okay, I know there are 13 prime numbers here. That'll be super good. But then I give it some thought. That's probably more about the projectors compared to associations. So the associations, just want to be clarified. Let's say I think B is blue, or B is green, right? But now if you give you 10 by 10, all of the letters, some of them are B, they won't be able to quickly tell. I sense blue here, here, and here.
Not an associator.
I see. So
by the definition we're using of what an associator is, that's correct.
Oh, okay.
That they would have to scan it. They would have to see the letter,
know the meaning.
That's right. And generally that involves putting the letter in foveal vision so that they recognize the letter as the letter. Right?
Otherwise, it will be beautiful. You can basically pick up any information out of oceans of information.
Yeah.
But seems like there's no free lunch.
Well, they and you know, interestingly, both projectors and associators who are grapheme synesthetes, they all have a commonality in that they argue that oftentimes they will find it easier to remember information because it's essentially another memory cue.
Easier to remember certain information.
Yeah, that there's synesthesia, and synesthetes of all types have made this argument that because of this multiple perceptual experience to a particular sensory input, that it's just an additional memory cue. And so as they're trying to recall information, where you and I might have 1 or 2 memory cues, they have +1, right? That's just one more thing that they can utilize to, like, oh yeah, I remember that because it was this, and it was red.
Has anybody tried to identify the connections between this and art? It seems like this can be or maybe all the artists are filling things when they try to paint with colors.
There is evidence that people who identify as synesthetic, people who have been identified as synesthetic, are proportionally more interested in art and are usually more involved in making art. I don't know that that makes them better artists, but they certainly are more drawn to and compelled to create art. And then there does seem to be this is a difficult one to really measure empirically because there hasn't been a systematic search, but there are a lot of musicians, and it seems like amongst musicians, there are more people who say, I have synesthetic experiences than non-musicians.
Hold on, so synesthetic experiences kind of happen with sound too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, can you just give an example, like how people will react?
So one of the more famous ones, which isn't very common, is called chromesthesia, and that's I was actually given an example earlier where every tone that they hear, it produces a color in their visual field, and they describe the color as if they're looking through tinted sunglasses. And so they'll say, yep, every time I hear an A key, and for some it's very varied, quite varied, right? So it might be every time I hear an A key on a piano, I see red in my visual field, and every time I hear an A key on a saxophone, it's a different color, right? Or everything within this particular, instrument is a shade of blue. In this particular
if you do a chord, do you see multiple color merging together?
I don't know. I think it differs based on the synesthete. Okay. But the way they describe it, they say it doesn't hinder my vision in any way, right? To them it's normal. For most of them, they don't know a world without that, and so it's not as if this is this thing that they have to live with. Right, it's like me saying, "Oh, you have to live with what it looks like to look around." Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's just their experience. So that's one form of it. There actually seems to be some emerging data that shows there's a lot of overlap between sound and taste and smell. So sounds will activate a taste in people's mouths, and sounds will activate a smell for people. So certain sounds, they have a scent that they experience anytime they hear this particular sound.
Is it two-way?
Some people.
So you do the taste, they will actually start to hear sound?
Yep. So that's rarer, that it is bidirectional.
Okay.
Most synesthetic experiences are unidirectional. So one stimulus input results in an experience not only in the appropriate sense, but a perceptual experience from a different sense. But I'd say, it's hard to estimate, but I'd say probably, I don't know, somewhere around 10 to 20% might be bidirectional. So if we go back to the color and number thing, if a certain number always makes them think of a color, does that color always make them think of a number? And that doesn't happen often. Part of the reason for that might be that you might have 5 different letters that are all green, right?
It's
or
not
blue.
1-to-1.
Right, exactly.
So it seems like we're mixing two concepts together, of two sensory data together to create experiences. Is it possible that one of them is so strong such that from now on you just won't hear things? Every time you hear that thing, you just have taste.
Instead of a sound?
Instead of sound.
I don't think so. Right?
I'm just wondering, like, sound goes to taste. If that thing is strong enough, maybe starting from now you won't hear the sound, but every time you hear the sound, it's just taste.
No, because everything that I know about synesthesia, and I feel like it's an area that I've done a fair amount of reading on. That the stimulus that you're experiencing, it's still being delivered to the appropriate sensory system. So it's always
a richer, like a add-on effect
yes.
instead of replacement.
Yes. Although, there is some old research, and I feel like it was maybe Roger Sperry who was one of the first people to do this, that actually took, I think it was mice brains, and they were taking the inputs from one sensory system and then wiring it into a different part of the rat's brain. And so essentially creating a situation where presumably this would work with us as well, that if we took all the projections that were initially coming from our auditory nerve and just rerouted them so that they went to your visual cortex, that you would in fact cease to hear sounds and you would just see sounds.
Really?
Yep.
Wow. What I heard was actually if you take the auditory signal and wire it to visual cortex, because our brain is so homogeneous, so basically eventually you will learn to listen with your visual cortex. But you're saying like you can also see actually the sound too.
Well, I mean, I think it's a pretty straightforward principle of neuroscience, and neuroscience more than neuropsychology, but that if you stimulate a part of the cortex that is responsible for processing certain perceptual or sensory stimuli, you will have an experience that corresponds to that sense. So when we're doing brain surgery on somebody and you remove the back of their skull and they're actually conscious after this, you wake them back up from general anesthesia, you take an electrode and you start poking around in their occipital cortex, they will report seeing visual stimuli. Mm-hmm. And even though there's no visual stimuli coming into their eyes, and it's very predictable. We know, like, if I stimulate this part of the occipital lobe in the left lobe, they're going to see something in the upper right visual field. And if I stimulate this part, they're going to see something in the lower right visual field. And so by that logic, if you then wired the auditory signals to go into the occipital lobe, presumably you should have a visual experience. But I think consistent with what you were saying, you could probably learn pretty quickly that visual experience corresponds to a certain sound wave. Right? There's actually a really interesting TED Talk by a guy who was born with a really rare type of visual disorder where he only has a single photoreceptor type. So he truly does see the world in shades of gray or shades of purple, shades of something, right? But it's just all monochromatic. And he, I believe, is an engineer by trade. And so he developed a device that is a camera that sits right on top of his head, and it points at whatever his head is pointed at, and it takes the visual input and it does some sort of Fourier analysis on it, and kind of breaks up what is the predominant wavelength coming from that area of the world, and delivers it in the form of vibration to his temporal bones right behind his ears, so that he can hear a vibration or a frequency that corresponds to the predominant wavelength at whatever the camera is pointed at. And as a consequence, he has learned that the wavelength coming off of grass sounds like this, right? And the wavelength coming off from a tomato sounds like this. That now he's had it so long that he knows what things are going to look like just by listening, which is essentially what you were just saying there, right? So now he's listening to the visual world.
It's difficult for us to say, does he experience the same thing as seeing in his subjective world, though, right?
Right, and I would say no, he doesn't.
No.
Right?
Okay.
But experience is subjective. And so, who's to say that I think it would probably be accurate, although we can never know for sure, but it would be accurate to say, no, he's not now seeing green, right? He's not now seeing red, but the experience that he gets when he's looking at grass, it has been enhanced such that it is now more dynamic, right? That it's not just the texture that he's seeing, but he's getting a vibration that corresponds to it, that over time, that association might become so strong that it's not the same experience we have when we see green, likely, but then again, I don't know what experience you have when you see green, right? And your visual system presumably works the same as mine.
Man, humans are just incredible. Especially human brains, just like there are endless possibilities with them. Yeah, just thinking about this thing just excites me.
Well, and if you don't mind, I'll add one more point to that. So, cochlear implants are basically, it's that person I just described. He calls himself a cyborg, right? So he is enhanced by machinery that enhances his perception. Well, the same thing is true for somebody with cochlear implants. That they're born oftentimes without cochleas and or non-functioning cochleas. And so as a consequence, what we do is we wire it up in such a way that they have a microphone external to their head, and then they actually take an electrode and they run that electrode down and connect it with the auditory nerve in place. And the microphone then has a transducer in it that has to take the sound signal from the environment and convert that into an electrical signal that can be delivered to the auditory nerve. So it's just basically electrical impulses. Well, of course, we do our best to try to say, well, what kind of electrical impulse is delivered to the auditory nerve when you hear a dog bark or when we hear a human voice? But to try to mimic the complexity of that electrical signal coming from our cochleas, at this point, we don't have the technology to make it perfect. And so the signal that a small child gets when they first hook up that cochlear implant from a human voice is bound to be very different from the actual signal that would come from a cochlea. But what is so amazing about a human brain is that very quickly the child learns this pattern that my speaker, my cochlear implant, has produced as a result of my mother's voice is pattern A. right? And even if that pattern's very different from their sibling who has a normal cochlea, the signal they're getting, they quickly learn this pattern means mom's voice. Different pattern means dad's voice. Different pattern means dog barking, right? Different pattern means the sound of a car engine. And their brain just very quickly says, oh, that's what this pattern means. And to them, presumably, it just becomes normal. And so, their experience arguably is just like ours. Even though we know the signal that's getting into their brain is physically, measurably different than the signal you and I are getting.
The difference we have between them is no bigger than the difference between two different people who has normal hearing, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's all just pattern and association, and their brain figures out this pattern means this thing. And that's, they develop normal language capabilities. They have pretty normal auditory discrimination abilities. It really is fascinating. But what they may in fact be getting might be physically a very, very, very different set of signals than you and I are getting.
They may be able to enjoy music too, right?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah,
Yeah.
Give them those kind of vibes too. Since we're talking on that, from my understanding, if some sensor is coming defected, we can basically replace it or repair it or add something to make you still get the pattern, so your brain is still able to process the information, and eventually you will be able to experience with those kind of signals. Now, our brain has incredible processing power. Even the computer cannot match our brain in a lot of areas, but our sensor is not the best. So do you think, now we're not talking about a defected eyesight, but can we use some device to replace, let's say my eyeball can only look this far. I want an eyeball similar to Eagle's so I can see miles. And wire that into our brain, and our brain eventually will be able to learn to process those kind of informations, so we can have enhanced perceptions. Number one, is it possible? Later we'll talk about it. Should we do it?
I would say it is possible within bounds, because part of the reason, so foveal vision is your center point of vision. And so that's exactly what you're looking at. And it's about a half a degree to maybe 3 degrees of your visual field, right? A little tiny area of central vision. And a way to test this is if you look at a book page or anything else, and you look at one word without taking your focus off of that one word, try to read the words to the left and right of it. And you'll see that you basically can't. You have to put, letters into your foveal vision to read them. And part of the reason that we are able to do that is because the photoreceptors in foveal vision have a direct line to the brain. So the wiring that goes from that photoreceptor through a bipolar cell, through a ganglion cell back to the brain, it basically gets its own direct line of communication. Whereas out in the periphery, you combine the input from 30, 40, 50 different photoreceptors down to one neuron going back to the brain. And so that one neuron has to represent a big chunk of space on your retina, versus right in the middle, that one neuron only has to represent the amount of visual space that is occupied by one photoreceptor. So it's really high resolution in the middle. With me still?
So it's like calibration with the origin. Right. It's almost, for me, if I think mathematically, that's where the origin is, and that's strong. So, and then everything else is kind of around it.
Sure, assuming I understand what you're saying there, but there's
I also feel like a calibration process for me.
The out in the periphery of vision, there's a lot of convergence. There's a lot of, you take a rich signal and you dumb it down basically, because you have to combine the signals.
So the resolution is low.
Exactly.
Right, and the one in the middle is resolution is really high.
Perfect, okay. Exactly. For an eagle, they actually have what we call divergence. And so that one photoreceptor right in the center of their vision, it doesn't just get its own line to the brain. It actually sends information from one photoreceptor to maybe 10 neurons that go to the brain. So each individual neuron going back to the brain only has to process 1/10 of the information coming from that one photoreceptor, which means it's basically magnifying the information to get back to the brain. And so this, in part, is why they have such acute vision for such a great distance. So back to our idea is, let's say that we take an eagle eyeball and we are able to implant it into our own and somehow are able to match up the appropriate cells in the optic nerve in this eyeball. There would be some trade-off, because we're already using all of the possible processing hardware back in our occipital lobe. And so if you were to have more richer visual information coming in from a better sensory, receiver, you would have to sacrifice something, presumably, right? Because of the way that the occipital lobe's set up. If you want more tissue devoted to processing something so that you can see more detail, you arguably would have to give up something.
Can it be temporary?
Yeah, maybe, right? Or maybe it's just...
If I don't talk now,
what if we...
I would see better.
So you just have to be quiet while you utilize some of those areas. I would say that would be my concern with it, is that... and you see this happening. I'll give you a different example. When people learn how to play the guitar as adults, if you look at the amount of tissue in their motor cortex that is devoted to the hand that is running the frets, right? That between being a novice and not knowing how to play, and then after I think a couple years experience, you see more actual tissue devoted to controlling the fine movements of those fingers. So it's not as if we are taking that, in this example, we're not taking existing tissue and just making it better. We're actually recruiting more processing tissue in order to do a more complex task.
And the tissue will be shared across multiple tasks.
Yep. Yeah,
okay.
It can.
So it's not like if I use that thing, I will lose some ability of cooking simply because I don't have enough resource, right?
That's right. And this one, it's not a perfect analog between like the way your motor cortex distributes activity and the way your visual cortex does. Because, there's lots of different types of organization. There is a ton of similarity. There's probably more similarity than difference in the way that your cortex operates. But in that case, there's a lot of plasticity in the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex.
Compared to the vision.
Yeah, that probably, there's a lot of plasticity there as well. But it's, the visual cortex is laid out in such a way that we actually know more about it than pretty much any other part of the brain. And it would be an incorrect term to say that it is simple. I think a better way of saying it is that it responds very predictably to certain stimuli. And so in that way, there's probably less sharing of tissue for multiple activities in the primary visual cortex. When you get to the higher levels of visual processing, I think there's a lot more overlap, that this area might be involved in a number of different tasks. But certainly in V1, in that primary visual cortex, it's pretty predictable.
So this it's like the lower layers are designed for processing quickly the first round and second round, but when you push it to general intelligence, now that's where everybody start to share.
Yeah, I think that would be a good summary.
Interesting. So basically what you're saying, if I listen correctly, like the lower level V1, V2 for visual cortex have limitations in terms of capacity, roughly.
Yeah, I think that would be accurate.
Okay.
And I'm speculating more than anything here because I'm not as familiar with I'm sure that there has been research where they have attempted to have parts of that cortex, process other things. I don't know.
That's what I have in mind is actually, if somebody came up with some organs deficit, some sensors deficit. So let's say I never use my visual cortex because I'm blind. Would that place be freed out for something so I can actually have a richer listening simply because that part is never used? So brain start to utilize it and try to say, hey, I want to use it for something else.
I think there's evidence that you can utilize it for other tasks, but not indiscriminately.
I see.
That if I remember correctly, I think there's some evidence that when you are doing really fine tactile discriminations, like Braille, for example, that there might be some recruitment of some of the visual areas, in particular early visual area, well, kind of all areas there, but to have you get a sense of the separation of these, like, what am I actually feeling? And gosh, I'm trying to remember if they've done some of that research with people who actually are congenitally blind, because certainly what happens is if you or I are blindfolded or just have our eyes closed and you measure the activity of our brain and you have us reach into a bag and feel something and identify it, right? So what's this thing you're touching? I think you almost always have visual system activity. But that is likely due to the fact that it is automatic for us when we feel something to think, what is this, right? And to
it's
visualize
like the same thing
it
when
naturally.
I say like a picture the face of your family member thing.
Yeah.
It's like imagination is basically involving visual cortex, right? Okay, makes sense. What do you think? What's your thought on what Neuralink is trying to do? The company Elon Musk had trying to plant chips into people's skull.
Well, I mean, can you tell what? I'm not as familiar with like what.
Yeah, basically.
Did he say what is the goal of doing?
The goal is doing is actually, give you more storage, give you more memories, and give you better processor, like a computer. So basically, they try to actually wire a chip with a certain part of your neurons, and they're trying to make sure that you don't lose too much blood. It's not painful, and then basically, let's say before you have 20 gigabytes, now you have 25 gigabytes. You can memorize more, maybe.
Yeah.
Or you can see more, because you just increase the one we just discussed was actually increase the power of the sensor.
Yeah.
Now let's increase the power of your central processor.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is that as much as we use it, I think the brain as a computer is probably not the best analogy, because our brains are not organized in the same sort of functional manner that we would organize a computer, right? They're the end result of an evolutionary process that is messy, and basically you can't take the existing brain offline while you develop a new part of it. And so it's really more like a patchwork when you look at the complex brains of hominids, that you have the brain stem and the basics that, anything that has a brain stem, that keeps its basic living functions going, right? So it keeps its heart rate and its digestion. And then we see these areas that are, essentially like kind of on top of that.
A reptile, yeah.
Yeah, and then the cortex is kind of on top of all of that. And when you think about it in terms of, as these organisms had the opportunity for evolving and face these different environments, and that it would be useful to, that's not even the wrong language, right? To rather with some mutations or some alterations, and all of a sudden this thing is a little bit better at doing this, and so it passes on the likelihood of continuing to develop that area, that you see this development of a new part of the brain that is doing something. But if you could start from scratch and like design it like you do a computer, you probably wouldn't do it like we do with brains.
Definitely not. Yeah.
And so this idea of taking a chip and plugging a chip in and just having extra storage, I think it kind of ignores the fact that that's not really how the brain works, right? That distributed representations are really the best way to understand memories. And so when I ask you to think about, if I think about, like, imagine your childhood home or your grandmother's house, or that, to do that, to have that memory involves a whole bunch of your sensory systems, right? So you're going to activate your olfactory system. It always smelled like cookies at my grandma's house, right? And it's going to activate your visual system, thinking about what it looked like in there. And you're probably going to get some limbic system activity because you have strong emotional feelings involved with it. And all those things represent that memory, but it's not like, oh, access RAM, right? Bzz, here's that memory. Now, there are parts of your brain that are involved in that, like coordinating, right? Like, oh, to think about grandma's house, we need to activate this pattern. And so, we know the hippocampus is involved in a lot, at least the consolidation part of that. But I don't know. I don't think that means it's impossible. I just, Elon Musk is sort of famous for throwing out these awesome ideas that are,
and crazy
300 years away from, practical implementation.
Interesting. Yeah, I have a lot of students asking me questions in this. My response is, brain is so complicated, and we basically don't know much about consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So every time we have something new, we want to try it on it. So the first time people think it's a steam machine. And then after a while, we got all the electricity. They think clearly this is an electrical machine. Yeah. And now we think, okay, we have computers. It's clearly brain is a computer, and then brain is quantum, and then later brain is like quantum computers and everything. So yeah. But so far, I can see how you can compare a machine to the theory of computations, right? But still, yeah, I don't buy that idea of brain is a computer at all. So that's why, listen to Neuralink doing stuff. I feel like it's really great in terms of like anatomy, things people are trying to do, make it safe and make it low cost and energy and everything. But still, yeah, I kind of feel the same way you do on that thing.
If nothing else, I mean, sometimes we learn a lot just, as we dig around and realize like, nope, that's not it. And that's not it. And I mean, that's good science too sometimes. if somebody like Elon Musk has the money to throw at it and go down avenues that we think aren't going to be fruitful, I mean, at least for now we can say that didn't work out. Right? We tried that didn't work, right? And
cool. Yeah, I think we actually already hit 90 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So that's all for today, I would say. But I would like to actually invite you later on this to talk about something else.
Yeah, I feel like we had a whole list
neuroscience.
of stuff that we... Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This was fantastic.